year ago, I attended Agile Australia to find out more about what these Agile folk do. I was increasingly being asked to pick up Agile projects. And while I thought what I was doing was kind of Agile, I did know that, like change management, there are varying levels of purity, and I wanted a deeper understanding of it. Now, in the breaks, people would come up to me and they would say, well, what do you do? And on hearing me say, I'm a change manager, they would say one of three things. The first was, oh, what's that? And I would tell them, and there'd be this perplexed look. And the second, they'd go, oh, we've got you people in our place. You give out hugs. Now, let me dispel that myth straight away. We do not give out hugs, and there is nothing soft about change management. And the third thing they would say is, oh, we've got people like you in our place. Do you use ProSci or ADCA? And on hearing that, I'd say, well, no, I don't actually. They'd say, well, how do you know what you have to do? And at that point, I thought, well, there probably is a really significant need to do a little bit of translating of organisational change for the Agile community. And that is the intent of this presentation. I'm Jen Frahm, and I'm here with Nicholas Martin. We had the incredible pleasure and fun to work together last year on our project. Now, before we go any further, let me be a little bit clear on what we're talking about with organisational change management. So when we talk organisational change management, we're talking, as it's defined here, by the Association of Change Management Professionals, not change management in a technical sense, being ITIL frameworks or scope changes and change requests, things like that. But Nick, would you now like to share a little bit about our case study and what we worked on?
Sure, Jen. So our case study is based on the Workday project at Aurecon. Now, Aurecon is an engineering and professional services firm, and they offer a whole range of engineering across their network of 80 offices in 28 different countries. Aurecon's got 7,000 staff, and the majority of these staff work in Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. To begin talking about our project, we should really go back to the beginning of last year. February 2015 was when Aurecon began their transformation journey towards market agility and innovation. This is when the new CEO, Guillaume Swagers, joined. And if any of you are familiar with Guillaume's time at Deloitte Australia, you'll know he left a legacy of gender equity, a flatter organisation, and drove a culture of innovation and design thinking as the drivers for consulting value. And these characteristics very much spoke to his intent at Aurecon. So this meant it wasn't long before Aurecon saw the arrival of a Chief Digital Officer, a Chief Innovation Officer, and a Director of Design Thinking. All of this left the traditional engineers who wanted to remain at Aurecon being asked to become agile, innovative design thinkers. At the same time as this, our Workday project formally kicked off. To represent the global nature of the new Aurecon, our first release of Workday needed to occur on the same day to all 28 countries and 7,000 staff. There was to be no phasing by functionality, geography or business unit, and we had 8 months to do it in. Now, for those of you not familiar with Workday, it's a software as a service or cloud-based HRIS ERP solution. Workday use an iterative methodology with progressive rollout of changes and features. Prototyping, demonstrations and walkthroughs are core to the functional delivery of the solution. Now, the Workday program of work also included the redesign of the global HR function supported by a new operating model. This meant creating a single set of global processes and redefining HR's value proposition. Our starting point? Well, it was an assortment of service offerings with a set of bespoke structures and processes for each country. These were more often than not run from spreadsheets and saved to local hard drives. The move to a new operating model saw the design and installation of a shared services team offshore. And when the Workday project started off, it was structured for waterfall. But challenges with the delivery date soon meant we reorganised with the agile practices shown here. And it was at this point that we really got momentum on the project. So our first contribution to the project as change managers was helping restructure it from a waterfall to an agile delivery. In this, we took on the role of educating the project team in the philosophy and practices of Agile, helping them accept this new approach.
Thanks, Nick. So, organisational change management can be very complex and a very broad church of practices. At its most basic, however, it's how do we help people through the normal emotional and pragmatic challenges of adopting a change to accelerate the benefits of that change. This diagram here represents the change lifecycle, and it's emerged from a combination of Kubler-Ross's work on the emotional adaptation to dying and grief, and the family therapist Virginia Satir's model on how families deal with change. It's important to note that this particular model or framework that you're looking at deals with change that incurs loss, and we need to be mindful that not all change incurs a loss. So this is not a prescriptive model, nor do all people necessarily respond in this way to change. Having said that, both Nick and I have found it pretty close to the mark of what we see in a lot of organisations. It's not dissimilar to the Gartner hype cycle or the J-curve of innovation in that there are a number of stages to go through before you get to the good bit. So initially, people, when they hear of a change, move into denial. They can exhibit expressions of fear and resistance. Some become paralysed before they land in the valley of despair. At this point, they either exit the organisation or withdraw from the change. Those who are more resilient will start to test the new changes, adapt to it, and use it so that it starts to add value. Ideally, they then move into a space of commitment. What's important in this particular model here is the productivity baseline. Our goal as change managers is to get people through the valley of despair and back into the testing and adaptation as quickly as possible. Good change management skinnies and flattens the curve. Now, when it comes to Agile, the guiding question for change managers is what is the MVP of organisational change management? In that, what is the minimum that we need to do to get people productive with the change? If you try and overlay a full-blown organisational change management model or methodology into an Agile initiative, you're going to trip yourself up and create a lot of confusion. Some of you listening to this will be thinking why, particularly if you're familiar with Agile. Surely if you've got the product owner in your Agile teams confirming the changes, there'll be automatic acceptance. Well, if we think about Darrell Connor's commitment curve of change, where we seek to move people from awareness to understanding to acceptance and commitment, your product owner is always ahead of the curve and often needing help to move their people through in following them. We had a great example on the project. On the very first day at Aurecon, I introduced myself to the vendor partner, and he said, well, who are you and what do you do? And I said, well, I'm the change lead on the project. And he said, oh no, Workday doesn't need change management. People love it. And you know what? He was right. We got excellent user adoption results. But he was also pretty wrong, because there was a significant amount of change management that had to occur to get people used to the idea of continuous releases. Harmonising of processes and design principles meant that many areas were going to lose in terms of what they were used to, because you shouldn't customise software as a service system.
So how exactly did we skinny and flatten that curve for others? Well, we tested, we learned, and we adapted our own approach. Now, one of the common misconceptions about change is that it's linear, whereas good change management, by its very nature, is a series of feedback loops. And it's where the learnings from the interactions or findings from assessments result in tweaked plans that are improved and ready just in time for the next round of engagement. For those of you wanting to understand the change management process that we used and what it looked like, here's our adaptation of Captech's model of organisational change in an agile way. In this, we show our processes of change and how they mapped to Workday's delivery approach. And while at the outset or at a first glance, this looks very sequential, in practice it was very iterative. Build, measure and learn were at the heart of all of our efforts. The feedback loops were many.
So let's have a look at some of the practices that we used in our Workday project, which we think were representative of what Agile change management could be. So the first thing is, if you think about in traditional change management efforts, we start off by mapping all of the relevant stakeholders and determining priority and importance. Then we start interviewing them to understand their position on the change and their preference for change. You then take that away and you turn it into a really detailed strategy document that needs to be signed off. With Agile, you can hit the ground running by using a practice called working out loud. Some of you may be aware of this practice. It's known as #WOL, and it's been popularised and advocated by Simon Terry and John Stepper in the industry. So when you use working out loud as your practice, you narrate your work publicly, so via Yammer or via public wall or in a town hall meeting, so that other people can contribute to your work in a collaborative fashion. You work from the fundamental assumption that you don't know everything. So we started here by running a reverse go live, which is a tool in the Change Manager's Toolkit. It's not dissimilar to those of you in the Agile community who are familiar with futurespectives. So we start with the go live date on a very long piece of paper or a wall, and we work backwards to map all of the dependencies that will lead up to it. We do this typically with a team and getting people from the various streams to map what they actually have to deliver so we can look at the change management dependencies. Now, by posting this on Yammer and other public communication channels, it gives stakeholders the opportunity to join in. And certainly it gives you a broader group of stakeholders to engage than just the ones that you think that you've identified. Now, it is risky as you are publicly letting people know that you don't know everything, and effectively your change communication kicks off as people start asking questions you may not have the answer to. So you need to be really comfortable at facilitating conversations of uncertainty.
So something else we did a little differently in addition to working out loud was the heavy use of visual management. In this photo, you can see our engagement space with its visual representations of our change program. It's worth calling out here that this was in addition to the task-based or Kanban style wall where we tracked our change management tasks alongside the tasks of the other project streams. It was this second space, however, this space near our desks, that we'd bring people to. It allowed us to tell the whole change story to our stakeholders by adapting that conversation based on their sphere of concern. Here we'd openly share their methodology, our change plans, and representations of the adoption pathway. Walking others through this information, we'd sound out new ideas and we'd seek their input on our next steps. And somewhat differently, we'd take their verbal feedback and nods in place of formal sign-offs. So let's check in with what we've done a little differently from your waterfall change manager so far. First, we've championed the view that 60% done and shared is way better than 100% perfect and never used. What we mean here is that in waterfall change management, there are quite often very formal version controlled change plans. And these are developed by change managers using their expertise. And often it can be seen or is a career limiting move for a waterfall change manager to release anything where they're not confident it'll be signed off. So let's contrast this with an agile change manager who never perfects plans. They get them to a point where they're ready to be shared. They get them to a point where they're ready to be finished together. And as Jen said before, they confidently say, I don't know the answers, but let's find out together. And they do this knowing that later on it's really hard for stakeholders to push back on a plan they've helped create. Now the next thing we did differently was to be subjective. Now change is personal and people are subjective. And we say lean into this. We say use this subjectivity to amplify your change efforts. Now in Waterfall, you might spend much time figuring out which change metrics to use and how to measure them objectively. We didn't do that. Instead, we use subjective measures to generate conversations of clarification and understanding. And here you can see a really early version of our change scorecard showing these subjective measures. Now, to start off with, we chose the characteristics that would lead to the desired change outcomes. Then, as you can see here, we'd rate the impacted areas and functions against these measures using the familiar red, amber, green reporting. This was a continuous and transparent activity. The scorecard was prominently shared on our wall and was reviewed in project and steering committee meetings. Now, in reality, these assessments were highly subjective, but their value was in how they started the dialogue. For example, we'd have senior leaders walk up to us and ask, "Why do you have this red? And what will it take for me to get it to green?" There'd be other times when they'd tell us outright, "I think you're wrong." But then they'd share their insights, explaining why. So by leaning into this subjectivity and having these open conversations, collectively we all grew wiser.
Thanks, Nick. It can often be said that in traditional change management, you experience death by documentation, with strategies and plans that are pages and pages long, and you're killing trees all over the place. This was what our change plan looked like. We worked with plan to a page, and by providing a high-level representation of the various streams of our work and what we were going to do across phases, we were able to take this particular image in an A3 printout and take it to meetings and discuss with stakeholders, and they got a sense of where they would fit in and what they would be doing. Now, again, this doesn't get in the way of the change work plan or the Kanban style task backlog that we were using to get into the details, but your stakeholders rarely need the details. And so in terms of what you present to the business, a plan to a page is sufficient. This particular concept is, we call it potatoes, potatoes. So in traditional change management, the organisational change manager is really focused on the people side of change, and they need a deep understanding of the different audiences and needs. It's kind of the same thing with Agile change management, but a subtle shift. In this, we're often the guardian of the persona and the user experience. And where it differs from traditional change management is, rather than protect the people from the change, we encourage people to explore and adapt and try new things and get them through to that level of productivity by empowering rather than protection. One of the things that we did in our initiative, which was kind of cool, I think, from a change management perspective, is we were able to move away from the traditional view of change champions, which has become a bit of a poison chalice in a lot of organisational contexts. So traditionally, change managers are expected to recruit, develop, manage formal change champion groups. And this has become increasingly fraught now that most organisations have got multiple change initiatives happening. So the person that you identify as a natural change champion has most likely been tapped on the shoulder by half a dozen other project managers. So the alternative and the more agile way of viewing things is to tap into the social architecture of the enterprise. This draws from Luke Gallopin's work on social architecture and community. So every organisation has natural tribes that you can tap into and build or enable feedback loops via check-ins, online conversations, or discussions with the tribal leaders. In Aurecon, these included the regional HR teams, the group called Limelight, which were early career professionals, and we established an enterprise group on Yammer called the Digital Pioneers. It was opt-in and clearly identified that they would be expected to lead Aurecon through digital transformation, which happened to include Workday as the first of the digital transformation pieces. This self-selection and invitation occurred by the public description of the attributes, so we wanted them to identify as being collaborative, open-minded, curious and resilient. And we made an explicit call out to the roles and responsibilities of taking part or being identifying as a digital pioneer. The Agile Change Manager role becomes one of content curator and nurturer of that community until it was fully active and self-sustaining. And this moves the understanding of a change champion from a hierarchical appointment and transactional behaviour where we reward them for activity to being a change champion is just something that we do in this organisation.
Thanks, Jen. And just as we moved away from traditional change champions, we tweaked our communications approach. Now, in an agile setting, there needs to be less reliance on the formal top-down communications, and your activities need to be more responsive. Let's go for content that's being curated for the various communities, and preferably having that content contributed by the users themselves. Instead of not knowing whether communications had been received or understood, we move towards a continuous cycle of communicate, measure, and adapt. Now for this, you need just-in-time, simple, and actionable data. And this is where your communication platforms will help or hinder. Software services like MailChimp or Campaign Monitor, together with your CMS and Yammer on intranet pages that give you an audit history of user access and data, can give you this data. We found it was their ease of use and automatic data capturing that were crucial to enabling our nimble and responsive communications. For example, here on the screen, you can see an email or some data and some insights into an email we sent to one of the tribes, our Limelight group. From here, I can drill down and see who's received the email, who's read it, and what action they've taken. But most importantly, I can see where the message isn't working. In this example, I was able to drill down and see that the email wasn't hitting the mark in one of our offices. Knowing this, I was able to get onto the Limelight share in that office. We agreed on the corrective next steps, and next time around, we automatically took this into account in our communications approach. Now, another couple of tools that we used heavily in the program were Trello and Office Mix. As well as using Trello for the management of day-to-day change activities within our distributed change team, we found it hugely supportive when it came to issues management with our stakeholders and change communities. Trello painted the picture. It gave real-time visibility of what was being prioritised and progressed, meaning they could contribute to the solutions. We also championed Aurecon's rollout of Office 365, and we were pretty early adopters of its Office Mix functionality. Now, Office Mix is like PowerPoint on steroids. It allows you to create presentations and voiceovers like this one, turning them into shareable video files straight from PowerPoint. And when you share the videos, the viewing data is automatically captured for you. And using Office Mix, we were able to repurpose content from our demos and walkthroughs to create on-demand snippets and sneak peeks for our change communities. Now, initially we started out using this to make some demo sessions available to our project team members in other time zones. But based on the viewing data, we started using it more and more. We started curating playlists for both the project team and our change communities in response to their feedback and interest. So what started as an experiment soon became a key tool in our change efforts based on the insights from early use.
So, having looked at half a dozen of our practices in terms of what we did that we think contributed to Agile change management, what of these can we abstract to an enterprise level and be thinking about enterprise Agile change management? We think that there's 5 buckets really that represent some useful thinking. The first is people want to contribute to the solution, so the importance of having collaborative tools is paramount. When you give them the tools to do so, they will co-create. The second is to use the social architecture. And so these are the tribes that already exist that you can tap into rather than the administrative overheads of managing formal change champion groups. Of course, co-creation is powerful. It means that people move themselves through that change curve. One of the more challenging things for existing communication teams is to restructure and think about different skill sets. So less of formal approval and control and sign off and more of data-driven content creation. And finally, and perhaps most controversially, is this notion of using subjective success measures as conversation starters. It's okay to be subjective if it starts a conversation, because doing is better than perfect. Now, one other thing to consider is that really good organisational change management operates at both a project change and an enterprise change level. It's often hard to distinguish between the two. So, to that end, project change managers become change champions for enterprise agility. We build the values of enterprise agility into our change projects and programs. Now, of course, this can present as challenging, though, when your project is already building an Agile momentum and acceptance of the values of Agile, and the organisation is lagging. So for us, Workday was the first of the global transformation pieces, and it was built on design principles of trust in your people and transparency. These were not values that were widespread at the time we were ready to release, which meant that the change managers of the team had to drive a lot of what was to come. The other challenge, of course, becomes, between project and enterprise agility is how do you stay focused when at the appropriate level, when you've got thousands of changes being made a day? What of this do you engage with the business about? This type of dilemma only occurs when the change manager is thinking in traditional methods of change management. The sooner they can move to a mindset of what is the MVP of our organisational change, the sooner they can manage the dilemma of 1,000 changes being released a day. This slide here presents an example of how we drove those the values of enterprise agility from the project perspective. So one of the things we did was we created a change management group on Yammer, and every Thursday we released a hashtag Thursday Thought Leader, which was somebody who had contributed to the world of change management, innovation, design thinking, and Agile. So in this way, we could start to introduce some of the fundamental concepts of Agile in a way that was linked to their change management practice.
So far, we've looked at change in an Agile context, and we've shared some examples of what we did on our Workday project. And Jen has just talked about transferring some of those lessons to build enterprise agility. Now, the other thing that we think is worth unpacking at this point is the idea of role clarity within your teams. That is, clarifying how the role of an organisational change manager intersects with the more familiar Agile roles. Why? Well, this is because a good organisational change manager has a broad toolkit and is very flexible. They are the protean project team member, facilitator one day, motivator the next, moving from problem solver to guardians of adoption. And that's why, as we see it, good change managers can do one of three things. First, they can bolster or amplify your Agile capabilities. For example, taking on the role of keeping the team honest when it comes to the Agile philosophies and practices, something that's important given the newness of the Agile approach to the team. Secondly, they can supplement your Agile capabilities. If you're missing something, the change manager can fill that space, perhaps standing in for the Scrum Master when they're unavailable, or at other times being guardians of personas if there's an absence of a UX specialist on a project. Now, all of this is awesome if you need these capabilities bolstered or amplified. But if the Agile team don't know what the change manager is doing, or that they're doing this, it can lead to role conflict. So the third thing that an organisational change manager might do is clash with your Agile capabilities. Now, ultimately, in any setting, a lack of role delineation on a project is likely to result in some form of conflict. So it's worth having a role clarifying conversation at the outset. So with that said, and now that we've talked about why you need an Agile change manager on your project, it's probably time to mention that not all change managers are the same. And with the rapid rise of the change profession, the question is, who should get the green flag on your next Agile initiative? The answer is a shapeshifter. You need yourself a protean project team member who shares control, someone who is comfortable with ambiguity. You don't want someone who needs 100% of the detail. Opt for someone who says, I don't have all the answers, but let's find out together. Choose someone who's able to abstract ideas to a high level. Rather than a change manager who focuses only on their change, go for one who anchors the Agile project into the bigger enterprise transformation at play. And lastly, instead of someone who needs a paint-by-numbers methodology to produce artifact after artifact, find a change manager who recognises that it's not their change program, one who sees it as their role to foster it instead. Choose someone who can draw on their diverse toolkit, knowing what to use and when to use it. And go with someone confident enough to lean into that subjectivity and have the necessary conversations of change.
So back to the project, how did we go? What impact did Agile Change Management have? Well, with a team of 2.5 people and launching to 7,000 employees in 28 countries on the same day, in week 1 we had 40% of the company accessing Workday, and 75% of that usage was discretionary. So they got on with no need to do so and had a look around and played and updated their data and just explored the functions. We saw a new benchmark in employee usage of help pages, FAQs, online readership. The people teams were able to transact from day 1 with new processes, and People Assist received calls on day 1 and could resolve. The sentiment online was positive and excited. All regions were equally engaged. All known issues were mitigated. And I have to tell you, it was the quietest go live I've ever been on. In fact, we only got 7 queries on the Workday email in those first few weeks. So it was undeniably a really liberating experience for Nick and I to work in this fashion. There's no doubt about it. But I think one of the more liberating ways to think about Agile change management, and particularly our experience with launching a software as a service initiative, is the notion that it potentially becomes a Trojan horse for introducing continuous change capability and enterprise agility into the organisation. Now, for several years, I've worked with organisational leaders on the importance of structuring for continuous change and building their change capability. And there's inevitably a number of reasons why the time is not right to do that. But once they have actually invested in cloud-based software as service platforms, they've immediately committed to the ability to adopt continuous releases, get ready for them, make sure that the whole of the organisation knows that it's happening, and deploy them at speed. So one of the things that we had to do as change managers was we had to build those templates and do the development of the BAU, or the business as usual teams, to be able to do that. Now, we have had 1 Workday release since we went live last year, and in that time we have seen people who are not change managers, nor project staff, nor in senior roles in the organisation receive, assess, prioritise, adapt and communicate the next release. I think that bodes well for an agile enterprise in the making. We hope that this has been a valuable presentation for you. If you have questions or you want to continue the conversation around agile change management, you can find Nick on LinkedIn. Twitter is probably the easiest way to find me, but you're welcome to email or leave some comments or questions on the Conversations of Change Facebook page. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.